As violence, conflict, and bad blood between various foreign nations, Native Americans, and settlers erupted on the western frontier, so did the coordinated battles between each side. Some of the most famous wars and the battles that came between them occurred in the American West, such as the Texas Revolution, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and Red Cloud's War, just to name a few. However, beyond these massive conflicts and battlefields covered in bloodshed were much smaller conflicts that cannot fit within modern-day textbooks. The truth of the matter was, there were so many miniature wars and unsettled tensions that it would take thousands of pages of text to try and summarize every single conflict that existed on the frontier. Thus, to make sense of these smaller struggles and uncover the fascinating events that led to such chaos, here is the newest video in a series of essays analyzing the battles of the Wild West that you probably haven't heard of. Next up, we're taking a closer look at the Round Valley Settler Massacre and the untold story of a one-sided conflict that symbolizes the overall horror and disturbing nature of the California Genocide. The earliest seeds that would eventually cultivate the Round Valley Massacre started with one of the more notable events in California's history, the Gold Rush of 1849. After James W. Marshall's initial discovery at Sutter's Mill in the winter months of 1848, immigrants swarmed the lands of Northern California with haste. Most of them came with a thirst for gold and other delusions of grandeur, fueling the engines of greed amongst new settlers. By the mid-1850s, California's settler population ballooned from around 13,000 to 300,000. And unfortunately for most of the transplants, the gold didn't last forever, leaving those who moved permanently to find new avenues of livelihood and survival in the Golden State. Not only that, but these newly migrated settlers weren't the only ones to populate the northern regions of California either. They walked into the territory already inhabited with upwards of nearly 300,000 Native Americans. These indigenous populations were composed of various tribes that for generations had called the San Francisco area and the state of California their home. To make matters worse, the state legislature of California passed a horrific law a few years prior to the mass migration on April 22, 1850. Titled the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, the law made the kidnapping and enslavement of Native Americans legal for all white settlers. A year later, tensions were increased tenfold by California's civilian governor, Peter Hardman Burnett, who declared, "The war of extermination will continue to be waged. Until the Indian race becomes extinct, it must be expected." This political sabotage then fueled an even greater hatred towards the region's indigenous tribes, as a second legislative act was passed that year that legalized the formation of lynch mobs. To stoke the flames, these mobs weren't simply made legal, but rather expensed by the state of California to boot. The Golden State homesteaders were quick to take the government up on their offer, and by 1852, lynch mobbers had submitted north of $1 million in claims to fund their vigilante exploits. The biggest catalyst to the Round Valley Massacre came in 1854, when the region was first populated by settlers. In May of that year, 6 explorers from Missouri were looking for an easy route between the mining center of Weaverville and the river port of Petaluma. Led by Pierce Asbill, the settlers wandered through a rough terrain that was nearly impassable by travelers and entered the meadows of Round Valley. Upon entering the valley, Asbill and company noticed the tall grass was jostling in the distance. They soon realized they were not alone, as a band of Yuki Native Americans were living in the area. In fact, records show estimates of anywhere between 6,000 to 20,000 Yuki Native Americans living in the valley at the time. This was unacceptable for Asbill, whose hatred of indigenous nations pushed him to say unprovoked, "We've come a long way from Missouri to locate this place, and I'll be damned if wiggling grass will keep us away. Get a hold of your weapons, we are all going in." Going in is exactly what the settlers did. They located a creek bed deeper into the valley and discovered the local Yuki's encampment. With horses, guns, and a blind prejudice at their side, Asbel and company killed upwards of 40 Yuki, including women and children. Of course, the climate of California meant that any and all who were in charge would side with Asbel and the settlers who committed such atrocities. None of the men were punished or charged with first-degree murder, nor were they dissuaded from partaking in further lynch mobs. Asbel himself settled in the region he plundered, joining the local human trafficking rings where he kidnapped and sold Yuki women to other non-natives around Northern California. Over the course of a year, he sold anywhere from 30 to 40 women, reaping monetary gains from his initial act of violence, now forever known as the Asbel Massacre. Pierce Asbel wasn't the only settler profiting from the trafficking of Yuki women. Between 1855 and 1856, the practice became endemic in and around the valley, as single miners complained of the lack of women living in the area. Simon Storms was an Indian agent at the time, stationed in Northern California, and his meetings with the Yuki elders revealed disturbing patterns in the Yuki communities. They feared the white settlers to death, refusing to interact or go near their encampments. At this point, most Yuki adult men and women were too terrified to have children, terrified at the thought of their youth being stolen from them in the night. Without the resources to defend themselves, hiding was the only sensible response. Protection systems weren't the only resources starved from the Yuki peoples either. Another major catalyst to the Round Valley Massacre were the land and food sources taken control of by the settlers. The valley had once been the main hunting ground of the Yuki nation, sporting a large deer population vital to their way of life. The new settlers killed so many deer in such a short amount of time, the native populations could not feed their entire tribe. To make matters worse, access to the fields at large were blocked by settlers, wanting the small game and bountiful plant life all to themselves. It forced some Yuki households to kill off their own cattle, turning to limited supplies of beef to avoid starvation. When it came to cattle, however, the Yuki were still lambasted and falsely accused of killing off the settlers' cows and horses. With the influx of the population came an influx in livestock, which led to the abandonment of horses and other cattle that would wander off and die of natural causes. While there was nothing intrinsically wrong with these livestock deaths, the settlers fabricated the causes to be at the hands of the Yuki, reporting the native populations were at fault for killing cattle. 3 men of notable stature would later go as far as to form a plot to drum up hatred against the Yuki amongst neutral parties. California Superintendent of Indian Affairs Thomas Henley, future California Supreme Court Judge Serranus Hastings, and Hastings ranch manager at the time, H.L. Hall, organized public conferences and town halls to allow settlers to discuss problems started by the indigenous populations. Many of the grievances shouted out at these town halls were rarely ever true, and mostly consisted of made-up issues. To the men at fault, though, this detail didn't matter. As long as the rest of the community were okay with the ongoing genocide, they'd say anything and everything to tighten their support. Years later, this violent propaganda was uncovered by a U.S. Army lieutenant named Edward Dillon, who exposed the plot in the names of Henley, Hastings, and Hall. However, none of them were punished with long-term sentences. Instead, a San Francisco news bulletin in 1856 published a statement that read, "Extermination is the quickest and cheapest remedy and effectively prevents all other difficulties when an outbreak of Indian violence occurs." The result, much to no one's disbelief, a bloody and belligerent series of raids against the Yuki peoples of Round Valley, California, over the next 3 years. The Round Valley Massacres were carried on by a central group of 20 to 30 white settlers, who collectively counted as a majority of the entire settler population in the region. There had only been a few dozen occupants in the valley in 1856, and they took it upon themselves to pillage as often and as violently as they could. The leader of the band was none other than H.L. Hall, the ranch manager for Serranus Hastings, who organized the smear campaigns. Hall recruited other notable settlers, such as Dryden Laycock and William Scott, who would later testify against him. The story went that Hall and company would take routine trips into Yuki territory of the valley, killing anywhere from 50 to 60 Yuki tribesmen per raid. Raids usually occurred twice or sometimes 3 times during a 7-day span. These massacres involved more than murder, too. If the band of raiders stumbled upon a settlement that was inhabited but void of Yuki folk at the time, they would poison any and all food and water resources they could get their hands on. This included stuffing flour with sawdust chips. In addition, the settlers would assault and rape women in the Yuki camps, as well as murder their children without remorse. On October 8, 1856, one of these massacres took place in Clinton Valley. 55 Native Americans, almost all Yuki, were slain by the 30 marauders. A couple of months later, the Yuki's death toll had reached an estimated 300. Throughout that following winter, from the end of 56 into the beginning of 1857, another 75 Yuki tribesmen were killed. And not long after, one of the raiding settlers named John Lawson went on a cold-blooded warpath when a few of his hogs were rustled from his farm. Without proof of who exactly enacted such a theft, Lawson snuck into Yuki encampments and shot 3 of their members. He then imprisoned another 5 of them, lynching them on the way back through the valley. It was around this time an Indian agent by the name of Vincent Geiger had his comments on the Round Valley massacres recorded. He stated that the Yukis were mostly without any more children, due to the rate at which the children were being kidnapped and sold as slaves to settlers in and around Northern California. In September of 1857, all hope for the massacres coming to an end was lost. Superintendent Thomas Henley made it publicly known that the killings would not stop until every single member of the Yuki peoples was either deceased or driven away to another territory far from Round Valley. Later that month, a notice came into the Office of Indian Affairs, delivered by Geiger, who reported that a white man had been killed by a Yuki warrior. Whether this was a retaliation to Henley's incendiary comments or the murders themselves was unknown, but it only fueled the fire lit under the malevolent settlers. The following month, in October of 1857, Superintendent Henley attempted to cover up his own actions within the greater Round Valley Massacre. He sent multiple requests to both California and federal officials for troops to be deployed in Mendocino County. However, these requests were denied. The Secretary of War at the time was none other than John B. Floyd, a future general in the Confederate Army. He succeeded Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, and aided by his principles that it was not the United States military's objective to quell the fighting between homesteaders and Native Americans. Of course, Superintendent Henley wasn't offended by the denial, and continued on with the mantra that the complete extermination of the Yuki was the desired outcome anyway. In the early months of 1858, the massacres carried on. The first major attack was sponsored by a white farmer named Isaac Shannon. Shannon claimed that a second white man had been killed by a Yuki warrior, and killed 14 more Yuki tribesmen as a result. Between March and April of that year, another series of raiding parties ventured into the valley and killed anywhere between 300 and 400 male Yukis. This happened all within a 3-week span, a short amount of time for the sheer volume of bloodshed pouring through Round Valley. In June of 58, new settlers were arriving in Mendocino County from the Sacramento Valley. Before they reached their destination, they were intercepted by a few Indian agents, who warned the settlers of the locals' violent attitudes towards the Yuki. Despite their warning, though, the settlers waltzed into Round Valley and were immediately persuaded to join a raiding party that summer. By the end of the month, the Sacramento Valley settlers had killed 4 Yukis, much to the approval of the other white settlers. A few months later, in November of 1858, another string of massacres was set off when 9 Yuki tribesmen were ambushed and slaughtered by a party of white settlers. The Yukis had been traveling through the mountains, overlooking Round Valley, when they were blindsided in cold blood. Between then and January of 1859, a whopping 150 to 170 Yuki Native Americans were murdered, including countless women and children. Survivors were kidnapped into enslavement. At this point, California officials were investigating claims that had reached sympathetic members of government. Special Treasury Agent J. Ross Brown was one of these folks who traveled to Round Valley to get a better glimpse at the rumors of savage vigilantism. Before the vicious winter of 58 and 59 even took place, Brown was already privy to the hostilities taking shape by way of the 30 white marauders. He called the raids on the Yuki population a war of extermination. The following is an excerpt of Brown's documented reports on the Round Valley Massacres, specifically the atrocities of the aforementioned bloody winter season. At Round Valley, during the winters of 1858 to 1859, more than 150 peaceable Indians, including women and children, were cruelly slaughtered by the whites who had settled there under official authority. Armed parties went into the rancherias in open day, when no evil was apprehended, and shot the Indians down. Weak, harmless, and defenseless as they were, without distinction of age or sex, shot down women with sucking babes at their breasts, killed or crippled the naked children that were running about. Alongside Brown were 17 soldiers of the U.S. 6th Regiment of Infantry, who had been dispatched to Round Valley in January of 59. These soldiers witnessed firsthand the same brutal accounts written by the Treasury agent, but were unable to put up much of a defensive effort. You see, the Army had directed the small company to refrain from any conflict with the white settlers, and refused them the right to incarcerate any of the marauders. The local authorities also acted ignorant to the crimes at Round Valley, and were of no help to the 6th Infantry. The company's leader, Major Edward Johnson, wrote back to his central command of their inability to provide support for the Yuki peoples. He claimed that he and his men had attempted to peacefully negotiate an end to the raids, but the settlers wanted no part of a ceasefire. In March, the worst stretch of the Round Valley Massacres was underway, lasting 2 months into May of 1859. This series of raids was commandeered by none other than H.L. Hall, hell-bent on revenge for the death of his boss, Judge Hastings' horse. Rumor was, a couple of Yuki tribesmen had slaughtered the horse in the thick of night, but of course without proof, it was nothing but hearsay. Nonetheless, Hall led an attack that saw at least 240 Yukis murdered. At this point, Major Johnson of the 6th Infantry had had enough of the genocide and sent an honest report back to California's governor at the time, John B. Weller. The report included a statement that read, "The Yukas have not been, for the last 2 years, nor are they now, at open war with the whites. But the whites have waged a relentless war of extermination against the Yukas." Major Johnson pleaded for assistance for the Yukis, whom he was sure needed more protection than their white counterparts. Governor Weller reluctantly tried to intervene, asking Commander of the Pacific Department, General W.S. Clark, to send more soldiers and assist with Major Johnson's efforts. In a cruel twist of fate, though, General Clark denied the task, and a state militia captain by the name of F.F. Flint was dispatched instead. Unfortunately for Major Edwards and the Yuki, Flint was a supporter in the California Genocide campaigns, and told the raiding parties to continue their slaughter of the indigenous peoples. Major Johnson admitted defeat a few months later, knowing the minds of most Round Valley settlers had been made, as well as the governmental bodies that supported them. No one could be convinced to let the Yukis live in peace, and he and his 16 other infantrymen were stationed to a new post in California by year's end. The summer of 1859 saw larger factions of marauders carry on the violence across the valley. Superintendent Henley, now a former superintendent due to his termination after embezzling state funds, started leading massacres himself in his newfound spare time. In August, another 11 Yuki tribesmen lost their lives at the hands of Henley and a small band of fellow raiders. This came weeks after an adjacent conflict started in Round Valley, referenced both as Jarbo's War and Mendocino War. It was another series of massacres formulated by Walter S. Jarbo, a white settler of Round Valley who had made a name for himself in the enslavement and murder of Yuki peoples ever since the initial assaults took place in 1856. The Mendocino War lasted 6 months, saw 283 Yuki men slain alongside an uncounted number of women and children, and it was completely paid for by the California government. Governor Waller had earmarked over $10,000 in reimbursements for Jarbo and his mercenaries, highlighting his continued impact on the genocide of the Yuki peoples. By the end of both the Round Valley Massacres and the Mendocino War in the winter of 1860, one of the regional white settlers named William Fraser reported that no more children remained on Yuki land. He believed this to be the result of human trafficking. In total, an unknown number of Yuki tribesmen lost their lives. However, estimates have the official number at more than 1,000. While much of the California executive and legislative branches were either indifferent or supportive of the Round Valley massacres and related conflicts, a nearby news publication was not. The Sacramento Union, a daily newspaper established back in 1851, was privy to the violence and unrest in Mendocino County since the attacks began. They reported on various happenings, a part of the conflict throughout the 1850s, and in 1859 put an exclamation point on their coverage when they deemed the Yuki Nation doomed to extirpation. In April of 1860, the Sacramento Union then exposed the behind-the-scenes antics of California legislators and their state sponsorship of the Yuki Genocide. The paper accused lobbyists of ensuring the passage of a recent law that expanded the condition and overall age of Native Americans, legal for enforced enslavement. According to the Union, these lobbyists saw the potential profits to be made off of the slave labor of the Yuki peoples and surrounding tribes. To ensure their own wealth, the lobbyists then pushed the legislature towards expanding slavery for personal gain. These articles were filled with anonymous testimony and documents, proving the kidnapping of Yuki men, women, and children from reservations across the valley. One report in the Union stated that the recent California law authorizes as complete a system of slavery as ever was devised. Later in 1860, further political action would be taken to investigate the Round Valley Massacre. However, it started out as a motion by the opposing white settlers. A group of Mendocino County ranchers who had great political influence asked for a government-mandated inquiry into what they called Indian harassment, or a small part of the greater Mendocino Indian War. As a result, a joint special committee of the California legislature was created, with 5 members of the legislature appointed to investigate. The committee interviewed countless Yuki tribesmen. However, the white settlers were harder to convince. The Joint Special Committee quickly discovered that the claims made by settlers were actually of the reverse. It was the Yuki peoples who were being confronted with harassment, not dishing it out. The settlers' vicious actions had been exposed. According to Lieutenant Edward Dillon, most of the settlers did not want to testify against each other, and those who did entered a deposition and provided unreliable testimony. One notable settler to comply was John Burgess, who admitted for every cow or bull to go missing or found slaughtered, 10 to 15 Yuki folk were killed in retaliation. After the participating Yuki wrapped up their depositions, the 5 committee members debated their findings. 4 of them formed a majority opinion that the attacks administered by Round Valley settlers was cruel, unusual, and unjust. Here are a couple of excerpts from the majority report written by the committee. Accounts are daily coming in of sickening atrocities and wholesale slaughters of great numbers of defenseless Indians in that region of the country. Within the last 4 months, more Indians have been killed by our people than during the century of Spanish and Mexican domination. For an evil of this magnitude, someone is responsible. Either our government, our citizens, or both are to blame. No provocation has been shown, if any could be, to justify such acts. We must admit that the wrong has been the portion of the Indian, the blame with his white brother. In relation to the recent difficulty between the whites and Indians in Mendocino County, your committee desires to say that no war, or a necessity for a war, has existed, or at the present time does exist. We are unwilling to attempt to dignify by the term war as slaughter of beings, who at least possess human form, and who make no resistance and make no attacks either on the person or residence of the citizen. The next order of business was coming up with a plan to put a halt to the attacks on the Yuki populations. Those siding with the majority proposed an expansion of all Native American reservations found in the Round Valley. The borders increased to 4 times their current measurements. They also proposed a plan to purchase all of the property owned by white settlers in Round Valley, to help them relocate in non-Yuki territory. In addition, the state of California would send the Yuki reservations plenty of food resources, money, and above all protection, so that they might rebuild their communities. That being said, the majority opinion did not provide any long-term solutions to freeing the enslaved members of the Yuki at the hands of the well-off ranch owners. Regardless of the propositions they did and did not present to the California legislature, or the fact that they held the so-called majority in the first place, the state did not agree with their opinion. Rather, the legislature immediately sided with the lone minority report. California House member Joseph B. Lamar, of both Mendocino and Sonoma counties, was the only committee member to dissent. He stated that the settlers he investigated had acted in good faith, and their prerogative to enslave as many Yuki tribesmen as they could was satisfactory. The end of the minority opinion stated that the government shouldn't provide food or protection to the Yuki reservations, but instead reinforce their land as a reformatory camp to prepare young members of the tribe for slavery later in life. The California legislature was so heavily in favor of Lamar's dissent, the majority report was never even read in full to the legislative body. The legislature blamed the Yuki for the massacres of their own people, and quickly passed new laws that broadened the scope of slavery in the state of California. The decision resulted in more powers given to vigilante white settlers to force their indigenous neighbors into servitude as they saw fit. As the months went on, the number of raids and lynchings in Round Valley slowed but did not stop. The decline wasn't due to a change in attitude by its white inhabitants, but rather from the dwindling number of Yuki peoples left in the region. In 1861, a report was published in the Mendocino Herald after the editor of the paper visited the valley. He claimed there were no more than 600 Yuki left, despite their population ranging anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 just a half a decade prior. Enough marauders still tortured the lingering Yuki communities, however, and in 1862, a much larger company of U.S. troops were stationed in Mendocino County. Their presence eventually halted most of the violence still plaguing the Yuki peoples by the end of the year. In 1863, the aforementioned laws supporting the kidnapping and enforced slavery of Native Americans in California were finally acknowledged as hostile and terminated permanently. In 1864, another census was taken of the indigenous populations in and around Round Valley. Only 300 of the Yuki peoples remained. In the years since, the Yuki folk who survived the California Genocide were forced into a reservation conglomerate, where members of various Northern California tribes were also forced to relocate. This included rival tribes to the Yuki, as well as various languages and dialects that made coexistence insufferable. Without much of a choice, these diverse tribes remained on the Round Valley Indian Reservation before eventually founding their own collective, now called the Covelo Indian Community. The written depositions of the Yuki survivors, as recorded by the Joint Special Committee, have tragically since been either destroyed or lost. The Round Valley Settler Massacres of 1856 to 1859 and the California Genocide as a whole are dark marks left on the legacy of the Golden State. As evil and crooked as it might seem, it's important not to forget the unjust sides of history. May the accounts of these bloody and brutal atrocities be a stark reminder to everyone that these injustices are not make-believe. They are not folklore, nor fairy tales, nor pieces of propaganda. Nor are they memories of the frontier we will ever forget.